Welcome to Hot Health, a program that brings you current information on a variety of health topics that may impact your life. Today, we have Dr. Ruth Stanheiser and special guest Angela Saunders. She will be presenting on living your best life with nature's superfoods, right here on Smart Lifestyle TV and LLBN Network.
Angela, thank you for coming to be with us. I'm excited about your topic. We want to hear more about nature's superfoods. But before you start your presentation, can you please tell us a little bit about your background?
Okay, I'm a registered dietitian and I actually graduated here from Loma Linda almost 40 years ago, so that sounds like a long time. I've spent most of my career working as a clinical dietitian in hospital settings, looking after people with heart disease, diabetes, cancer. But for the last 15 years of my career, I have been privileged to be able to work with people to teach them how to prevent diabetes and heart disease and cancer and various other chronic diseases that we see so much today.
So when I listen to your answer, you've got an accent. Where are you from?
I'm from Australia.
Is that where you currently live?
That's where I currently live.
And my understanding is that you work with Sanitarium Foods.
I work with Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing. It's a food company in Australia owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We produce the number one breakfast cereal, whole grain breakfast cereal in Australia, and also soya beverages and other plant-based beverages as well. But more than producing food products, we actually have a very strong emphasis on health and well-being, such as our name, Sanitarium Health and Wellbeing. So we have corporate health programs. We have been involved in developing the new CHIP program. So we have a wonderful website that has lots of good nutrition information and great plant-based diet, great plant-based recipes, which are very nutritious and delicious. So it's a wonderful company to work for, and I've really enjoyed my time there.
Well, I'm excited to hear your presentation about nature's superfoods.
Thank you. Well, today I'm very privileged to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me, Ruth. First up, did you know that lifestyle choices such as smoking, inactivity, physical inactivity, poor diet, and alcohol cause about 90% of all deaths? And just one of those, our poor food choices, or what we call our modern Western diet, causes most of those deaths.
Wow.
So what do we mean by a Western diet? Well, I think these pictures say it all, don't they? In the Western developed world, like the US and like in Australia where I live, it's the meat-heavy meals, it's the highly processed and the fast foods that our grandmothers would just never say are foods. And it's not what we eat, is it? It's how we eat, and it's where we eat, at our desk, in front of the television, or even on the run in the car,
Yeah.
right? So just recently, we did a survey in Australia, and we've discovered that about a third of our meals, or our calories, one meal a day, is made up of these kinds of foods. So we also know that we are not eating enough fruits and vegetables. And this would be very similar here in the United States. We know that about 93% of Australians are not eating enough vegetables, and about 1 in 2 of us, or 50% of us, are not eating enough fruits. So sadly, the standard Western diet, or the American, Australian kind of way of eating, contains all the ingredients that actually rob us of health and vitality and actually increase risk of diseases. So things like refined carbohydrates, the white flours, the white sugars, the saturated fat, which of course comes mostly from meats and dairy products, and then cholesterol, which is only found in animal products. And then there's the pro-oxidants and the toxins and the carcinogens, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but also excessive salt, excessive sugars. Of course, we know most of our excessive sugars comes from soft drink, and that's a real problem. So it's a diet that's very high in calories and very, very low in nutrients generally. So we're spending billions of dollars. The marketing companies are spending billions of dollars to entice us to eat these kinds of foods. And we're surrounded by fast foods, aren't we, that just too easy to eat.
They look so good.
Too easy to eat, too easy to buy, just readily available. And so essentially, obesity is mostly a normal response to a very abnormal environment. So we believe by improving our food choices, we can prevent most chronic diseases and improve our health and well-being. So what's the answer? Is it all kinds of expensive diet plans? I mean, we see them, don't we, out there in the internet all of the time, telling us to buy this next fabulous diet. But unfortunately, most of this is really unsound advice and can be very expensive and often very harmful for us in the long run. So it may even be some concoction, you know, a whole lot of vitamin supplements or all kinds of fancy types of pills that people are recommending to you. But the reality is, the answer is actually very simple. We've got some amazing research now that provides us with the answer. So the answer is we have some very simple principles of health for whole person wellness, and that's what's really important. Now, you may have heard of the blue zones. These are communities of people who live with health and vitality right up to their 9th and 10th decades. We happen to be living or working right here, don't we?
Yes, we do.
Some of you in one of those blue zones here at Loma Linda. Now, they follow 9 simple principles, 2 of which I'm going to focus on as we speak this evening. They eat lots of plant foods, but very little to no meat. And they regard food as medicine. They know that plants have power to heal us and to improve our quality of life. So that's wonderful. So God has a plan for us, doesn't he? To live, he wants us to live longer, healthier lives, more abundant lives, using every herb-bearing seed, every fruit-bearing tree, or really whatever grows out of the ground for food. Now, over a century ago, our Adventist church pioneers actually recommended a lifestyle which today's science says is still very important for good health. And the true remedies of health we know are pure air, sunlight, abstemiousness, that just means temperance, rest, exercise, proper diet, the use of water, trust in divine power. That's still as relevant today as that was back when it was written, back in the 1800s.
And those were characteristics of all the diets of all the people who live in all these blue zones.
And very much so. Very, very important characteristics, as you say. Now, what we know from research of Adventists today, and we've discovered that they have 5 lifestyle factors that actually increase the longevity and improve health and well-being. So first up, it's eating a plant-based diet, so essentially not eating meat, and eating a handful of nuts regularly, so that might be at least 5 times a week, being active, not smoking, and being your normal weight. Now, each of those actually contributes an extra 2 to 3 years of life, or an extra 10 years if you have all 5 of them. Isn't that amazing? So it essentially tells us that we have more control over our health than we ever thought. So that's really amazing to know. And there's much accumulating evidence telling us why we shouldn't be eating as much meat. And that's very important now we know to eat less meat for health and well-being. So it's not just the saturated fat or the cholesterol in meat. We've learned that there are other substances as well that actually increase your risk of disease. So we're going to take a brief look at some of those, and there's lots of published information. So this is really good evidence-based information on why we should cut back on meat. Who would have thought that heme iron in meat is a problem? A lot of people think they have to eat meat to get enough iron.
Otherwise they'll be anemic or
Exactly, exactly. But did you know that it actually causes tissue damage, particularly in the bowel? And that increases your risk of bowel cancer. So that's one reason to cut back on meat, that's for sure. And then there's the heterocyclic amines and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, big words, and then also the nitrosamines. These are actually carcinogenic, and they're formed when meats are cooked at very high temperatures, like barbecuing. A lot of people in Australia love to barbecue their meats. And these also form during digestion as well. So that's pretty significant. And our gut bacteria actually will convert some substances in meat, like carnitine and choline, into a substance called TMAO. And we now know that this TMAO substance is actually a marker for heart disease and some other diseases as well. And then there's the advanced glycation end products, or we call them AGEs, which are formed when we actually brown or we burn foods. So there's lots of reasons why we should be cutting back on meat, and not just for health, but also for environmental sustainability. Now, because of all the significant concerns around meat, the American Institute of Cancer Research actually warns us that red meat and processed meats are a cause of colorectal cancer. Processed meats are a cause of stomach cancer.
Now, I'm just going to interject right here that the colorectal cancers, we used to think of those as cancers of older age, but it's becoming younger and younger and younger.
Absolutely. And especially now with the popularity of the paleo diet, where people are being encouraged to eat more meat, this is a real big concern. So now we have a great deal of evidence that high intakes of meat really will increase our risk of disease and increase our risk of mortality, essentially. Whereas the evidence is telling us that eating more plant foods will lower your risk for these diseases and increase longevity. So we've got lots of really good accumulated evidence that we've been collecting over the years to tell us this. But before we go any further, I just want to define plant-based diets, because we hear that a lot, don't we, in the media. So what does that mean? Well, first up, a vegan diet is a plant-based diet. So it includes no animal products at all.
So that's not even any milk, no eggs?
No milk, no eggs, no cheese.
Okay.
In some cases, no honey. And then there's the lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet, which we're probably a little more aware of. And that does include some dairy and eggs. And then the pescatarian, that will include some fish. And then the semi-vegetarian or flexitarian, and that's a term we're using in Australia more and more, which is interesting. People trying to cut back on meat, they'll have it occasionally, maybe a few times a month. So that's still considered a plant-based diet, but certainly not as strict as a vegan or vegetarian diet. Now, studies on Adventists are very, very useful, because only about half of Adventists will eat meat. The other half choose to eat mostly vegan or vegetarian, lacto-ovo-vegetarian. Now, since other aspects of their lifestyle are very similar, for instance, they don't smoke, they don't drink, it means that researchers can see very clearly what impact meat or other animal products has on their health. So it makes for very interesting research. So let's just look at some of that research right now. For example, a study on Adventists and diabetes shows that Adventists who are vegans or vegetarians have about half the risk of diabetes as those Adventists who actually eat meat. And the risk of getting diabetes actually increases as more animal products are eaten in the diet. And that's interesting, isn't it? Now, for hypertension, vegans actually have about a quarter of the risk of those Adventists that eat meat. And then for weight, we know that weight was much lower and more easily managed on a vegan and lacto-ovo-vegetarian diet. Metabolic syndrome, of course, is a combination of heart disease, diabetes and high blood pressure, and I'm sure you see that a lot as a doctor. And vegetarians suffer much less of this than non-vegetarians do. So it's very clear that as intake of animal products increases, so does the risk of disease. And we see this very consistently with the studies. So not only do plant foods lower the risk, but they also help to manage and to treat or even reverse these diseases and improve health and well-being. So that's really amazing. Now, because of this great evidence, we've got large health organisations around the world that all recommend that we eat more plant foods and reduce our intake of meat. And then there are the dietary guidelines around the world as well that are recommending we eat more plant foods and less meat, and even recommend limits on how much meat we should be eating.
I saw a word named pulse in there. What does pulse mean?
Pulse is just another word for legumes. So it's something, you know, some communities around the world will use that word. We tend to be more comfortable with legumes or beans, but it's all really much the same thing. Yeah. So what goes wrong if we don't follow the recommendations to eat more plant foods and less meat? Well, the underlying problem is, as you would know, chronic inflammation. It's a slow, silent, long-lasting, almost undetected fire inside of the body. It's an indicator that the body is in a state of oxidative stress. There is a blood test that we can use that will measure it, C-reactive protein. But just as an infected cut can cause inflammation in the body, we all know what that feels like, unhealthy foods result in chronic inflammation. So it's something that's foreign to our body. These unhealthy foods, the body just sees as a foreign substance and then reacts with this chronic inflammation. So all these ingredients, as I said, are like foreign substances causing this chronic inflammation and robbing us of health and vitality. But plant foods are very rich in a life-giving substance that puts out the fire of inflammation. Some of the most important ones are the phytonutrients. Some people call them phytochemicals, but I like to call them phytonutrients. And they act as antioxidants or anti-inflammatories, antihypertensives, antithrombotics, antiproliferatives, and that just simply means that they help to remove those free radicals that damage our cells and cause oxidation, reduce the inflammation in the blood vessels. That's often where heart disease starts, isn't it, with the inflammation in those blood vessels, preventing blood clots and also protecting us from cancer. So they're so powerful. It's just amazing. So God gave us this rainbow of colourful plant foods that contain thousands of these phytonutrients that work together to help us get the most benefit out of the food that we eat. And we know that the richer the colour, the richer the phytonutrient content. There are many, many types and varieties of protein, of phytonutrients, and here are just a few of those. You certainly don't need to know the names, that's for sure. But you might be thinking, well, can't I just take a pill or a supplement? Well, no, there's certainly no match for good eating habits. We know that whole foods contain thousands of these phytonutrients in very special combinations that simply cannot be copied in a pill. After all, a pill contains only one or two of these isolated nutrients. So, in other words, you can't take the goodness of a whole apple and put it into, or even a whole meal, let's say, and put it into a pill. Now, here is just a sample of some of the nature's real superfoods. Powerful plant foods such as capsicums, whole grain breads and cereals, broccoli, green leafy veggies, and even the good old apple. And you know, most of the goodness is in the skin, so we shouldn't take the skin off and discard it. Tomatoes, onions, garlic, berries, avocado, beautiful red grapes, lots of goodness there. and then nuts and seeds, legumes, herbs and spices, soybeans, and notice we've talked about whole foods, haven't we? Yep. We're not talking about supplements here. So these are the true superfoods. So the key is to eat a wide variety of these whole foods most of the time and to avoid these foods most of the time. Now, we've looked at how these foods reduce risk of chronic diseases, but they also have an incredible benefit for our genes, our DNA, our gut, our brain, and our lungs, essentially every part of our body. So let's briefly look at each one of these very, very quickly. First of all, can we change how our genes function just by the way what we choose to eat? Well, certainly we can. Your lifestyle choices can change how your genes function. And we know that they can turn off genes that promote disease. They can turn genes on that actually help you stay healthy. So in other words, if you've inherited some kind of at-risk gene, that's not necessarily your destiny. And isn't that really great news? And then there are plant foods that protect our DNA and our telomeres. Telomeres are just those caps at the end of our strands of DNA that actually stop our chromosomes from unraveling. And we know that as we get older, those telomeres will naturally shorten. Chronic inflammation actually speeds up the aging process and makes our telomeres shorten much more quickly, whereas healthy foods will protect and help to even lengthen those telomeres, which is great news for those of us who worry about aging too quickly. And then plant foods actually protect our gut and will keep it healthy. We've trillions of these gut bacteria called gut microbiome. There's some that are bad, some that are good bacteria, and that all depends on our food choices, essentially. So our good bacteria actually help with some very interesting aspects of our health, like our digestion, our immune system. Chronic inflammation helps to keep that low. We even know now that it may even lower our risk for cancer and obesity. So it has some very significant health influences, that's for sure. So there are very important plant foods like whole grains and legumes, which produce very important substances to keep our gut healthy and keep our immune system working as well as it possibly can. These fibres are very important foods, actually food for our gut bacteria. So there's lots of benefits of whole grains. They actually are great sources of fibre, very important for our gut, great source of iron and zinc, and also phytonutrients help to control our blood sugars, also our cholesterol, and therefore help to reduce risk of disease. And much the same for legumes as well. But legumes, interestingly, are actually a marker for longevity. And we find that communities that eat legumes, or these pulses, or these beans, actually live longer lives. So your gut bacteria are super sensitive to the foods that you eat and will respond very rapidly to changes. By eating more plant foods, especially these whole grains and legumes, you actually keep your gut healthy, which is wonderful. So believe it or not, the brain needs plenty of plant foods for mood, for our learning, for our memory and our cognition. This starts very early in pregnancy, we know. It helps to lower the risk of depression and anxiety. Plant foods are very important to nourish our memory, our learning centres. We know that junk food actually will shrink the brain. So eating more plant foods will actually improve our brain and how it functions. And we need plant foods to also reduce our risk of cognitive decline. And chronic inflammation is actually thought to be the underlying cause. Isn't that interesting? So obviously, if that's the case, we need lots of these phytonutrients, don't we, to keep our brain healthy. And then also plant foods help to protect our brain from decline. Do you know, it's actually just as important to have plant foods for our brain as it is for our heart, which is amazing. And then plant foods are important for our lungs as well, helping to reduce inflammation and risk of asthmatic attacks junk food is simply not good for our lungs. Who would have thought? That's just really amazing. So indeed we can say plant foods are important for our health and for our whole body, including our brain and including our lungs. Now some may actually wonder if a plant-based diet is nutritionally adequate. Do you get all the protein, the iron, the zinc, etc. that you need just from plant foods? Well, the largest nutrition organisation, you'd be familiar with this one, Ruth, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, says appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including total vegetarian or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases, and these diseases are appropriate for all life stages. Isn't that amazing?
From earlier statements.
Absolutely, absolutely. So we're eating more plant foods and less meat. It's certainly not just a passing fad. It really is the way of the future, and nearly about half of us are actively trying to do this and to reduce our meat intake for health reasons, as we've said, but also for ethical and environmental reasons. And certainly the food industry has jumped on the bandwagon, and we're seeing a lot more plant-based dairy, non-dairy milks and so forth. Very important for food security. We feed too many crops to the animals, that's for sure. We certainly can't feed a planet of 7 billion people on just meat. So we know that plant proteins are much more sustainable. We know that it requires much less water to produce plant protein rather than meat protein. And of course, there are all kinds of animal welfare issues. So I'll just finish with this statement. A plant-based diet is good for us and for the planet, isn't it? So reducing our dependence on meat is a good recipe for our own health and also that of our planet. Diets dominated by plant foods are almost certainly the way of the future. And this is a statement made by one of our top dietitians in Australia. She happens to be very much in the media, and she's probably one of the best advocates for plant-based diets, which has been tremendously helpful for us and has been a great colleague as well. And Albert Einstein says, nothing will benefit human health and increase chances for survival of life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet.
Thank you, Dr. Ruth Standheiser and Angela Saunders, for just sharing with us the benefits of a plant-based diet. If you're someone who's struggling with vegetarianism or trying to cut down meat, just remember it is a process. And as you are empowered with knowledge, it helps you make the right choice. And remember, health is more than just physical. It's also mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so I hope you learned a lot today from our program. Go ahead and find out more information at www.smartlifestyletv.com. Thank you for watching.